400 tons of timber, enough weight to flatten a house, crush a wagon, or bury a man beneath splintered pine. And in the forests of North America in the early 1900s, that weight had to be moved every single day, not by trucks, not by diesel engines, but by steam. Imagine standing in a forest so dense that sunlight barely touches the ground. Towering Douglas firs rise more than 200 feet into the air. The ground is soaked with rain, thick with moss, tangled with fallen branches and rotting trunks. The air smells of wet bark and smoke from distant logging camps. Somewhere deep in that wilderness, you suddenly hear it, a low metallic pounding, slow at first, then louder, then relentless, a deep mechanical heartbeat echoing through the trees. Men in the logging camps knew that sound well. They could hear it from miles away. And when they did, they knew one thing. The machine had started. Moments later, another sound followed, a sharp whistle cutting through the cold forest air. Then the grinding scream of steel cables pulling against impossible weight. And suddenly, the forest itself began to move. Logs as long as train cars started sliding across the ground. Dirt and rocks tore loose beneath them. Small trees snapped like matchsticks. Entire trunks scraped their way downhill toward a single roaring machine hidden somewhere beyond the trees. The men who worked there had many names for it. Some called it the steam donkey. Others called it the skidder. But in the logging camps, one nickname appeared again and again. The Iron Beast. Because once the machine started pulling, nothing stopped it. Not mud, not frozen ground, not hills, not even mistakes. And sometimes not even men. But here's the part most people never hear about. The real danger in those forests wasn't the falling trees. It wasn't the brutal winters. And it wasn't the isolation of logging camps buried miles from civilization. The real danger was the machine itself. Steel cables stretched tighter than rifle barrels. Boilers boiling under explosive pressure. Massive logs sliding through the forest like uncontrolled battering rams. One mistake, one snap cable, one moment of bad timing, and the machine could kill. In the early logging camps of Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, accidents were not rare events. They were expected. Some workers lasted years beside the machines. Others lasted weeks. And yet every morning before sunrise, the crews returned to the same roaring engines, because the Steam Skidder had become the heart of the logging industry. Without it, millions of trees trapped deep inside the forest could never reach the sawmills. Railroads needed timber. Cities needed lumber. And the growing nation needed wood faster than ever before. The forests were vast, but they were also stubborn. For decades, horses and oxen had tried to drag those massive logs out of the wilderness. Most of the time, they failed. The terrain was too brutal, the timber too heavy, the distances too long. Then engineers built a machine powerful enough to change everything. A machine fueled by fire, driven by steam, and capable of dragging entire hillsides of timber across the forest floor. It was crude, loud, dangerous, and unbelievably powerful. But the Steam Skidder didn't just move logs. It reshaped the logging industry. It changed how forests were harvested, and it helped build the railroads, cities, and industries of modern America. Yet behind the power of those iron giants lies a darker story. A story of brutal labor, explosive machinery, and men who stood only a few feet away from forces strong enough to tear trees from the earth. Because in the early 1900s, when the whistle blew in the logging camps, and the drums of the Steam Skidder began to spin, even the forest itself had no choice but to move. Before the age of roaring engines and screaming steel cables, the forests of the Pacific Northwest held a kind of quiet power. Miles upon miles of towering trees stretched across the mountains. Douglas fir, cedar, spruce. Some of them had been standing for hundreds of years. Their trunks were thicker than wagons. Their branches climbed higher than church towers. Cutting them down was already dangerous. But strangely enough, cutting the tree was never the hardest part. The real problem began after the tree hit the ground. Because once a giant tree was felled, it became something else entirely. A massive dead weight. Some of these logs stretched more than 100 feet long. Fresh with sap and moisture, they could weigh several tons. far too heavy for human strength. And yet, those logs had to reach the sawmills. Somehow. But here's the question that logging companies faced at the turn of the 20th century. How do you move something heavier than an elephant through a forest with no roads? At first, the answer was simple. Animals. Teams of powerful draft horses and oxen were brought into the forests. Massive leather harnesses were strapped around their bodies. Thick chains were wrapped around the logs. Then the animals pulled, slowly, painfully, step by step through mud and tangled roots. Sometimes it worked, but most of the time it didn't. The forests were brutal terrain. The ground was uneven, packed with rocks and stumps left behind from earlier logging. In the rainy seasons, the earth turned into thick mud that swallowed wagon wheels. In winter, the trails froze into slippery ice paths that could send entire loads sliding downhill uncontrollably. Animals struggled, wagons broke, and many logs never moved at all. They simply stayed where they fell, rotting slowly beneath the trees. For logging companies, this was a nightmare. The forest held millions of dollars worth of timber, but without a way to move it, the wood might as well have been buried underground. Some camps tried building wooden skid roads, temporary tracks made from stripped logs laid side by side. These helped the timber slide more easily across the ground. But building those roads required enormous labor. And once the surrounding trees were harvested, the road had to be rebuilt somewhere else. It was slow, expensive, and inefficient. Meanwhile, demand for timber was exploding. Cities across America were growing faster than ever before. Railroads needed wooden ties by the millions. Bridges required thick beams. Factories needed planks. Homes, ships, warehouses, every structure rising across the country depended on lumber. And the sawmills were hungry. They needed logs faster, far faster. But the forest refused to give them up easily. Logging crews could cut down hundreds of trees. But without a way to move them, those trees were useless. The timber industry had reached a breaking point. If something didn't change, entire logging operations would collapse under the weight of their own success. The forests were simply too big, too dense, too unforgiving. Then someone had an idea. Instead of dragging the logs with animals, why not pull them with machines? Machines powered by something far stronger than muscle. Machines driven by fire and steam. At first, the idea sounded absurd. A stationary engine sitting in the middle of the forest, pulling trees from hundreds of feet away? Many loggers laughed at the concept, until the first prototypes appeared. Small, crude steam engines mounted on wooden sleds. They hissed. They rattled. They leaked steam from every joint. But when their cables tightened, something incredible happened. Logs that once required teams of horses began sliding across the forest floor. Slowly at first, then faster, then in massive groups. Suddenly, the impossible problem of moving giant timber through wild forests had a solution. But those early machines were only the beginning, because soon engineers would build something far more powerful. A machine capable of pulling not just one log at a time, but entire fields of timber. A machine that would turn quiet forests into industrial battlegrounds. And when that machine arrived, the logging industry would change forever. It began with a simple question that echoed through the logging camps of the late 1800s. What if the forest could be pulled instead of crossed? For decades, men had fought against the wilderness. Horses dragged logs through mud. Oxen strained against chains. Entire crews spent days moving a single massive tree. But somewhere in the growing industrial towns of the American West, engineers were already experimenting with a different kind of power. Steam. The same force that drove locomotives across continents. The same pressure that powered factories and mills. Could that power be brought into the forest? At first, the idea sounded ridiculous. Steam engines were heavy, bulky, fragile. They belonged on railroad tracks or inside factories, not buried deep in muddy wilderness. But the logging companies were desperate. Millions of trees were trapped in remote forests, far beyond the reach of roads or rivers. The demand for timber was growing faster every year. So inventors began experimenting. One of the most important breakthroughs came from a man named John Dalbier, an engineer working in California in the 1880s. Dalbeer understood something simple but powerful. You didn't need to move the machine through the forest. You could make the forest move toward the machine. His invention was called the steam donkey engine, a compact steam-powered winch mounted on a sled. Instead of dragging the engine across the landscape, workers anchored it in place with massive logs driven deep into the ground. Then they stretched steel cables outward into the forest. When the engine ran, it pulled the cables, and the cables pulled the logs. The first time logging crews saw it work, the reaction was disbelief. Where horses once struggled to move a single log, the steam engine dragged several at once. Logs slid through mud, over rocks, across stumps. It wasn't graceful, but it was powerful. And in the brutal economics of logging, power meant profit. The early machines were crude. The boilers leaked. The engines rattled violently as they worked. Sparks flew from the smokestack. The entire machine shook as steam pistons slammed back and forth. But none of that mattered, because the results were undeniable. Production skyrocketed. Soon the machines became larger, stronger, and more specialized. Engineers added bigger boilers capable of producing more steam. They installed multiple winch drums so operators could control several cables at once. These improved machines became known as Steam Skidders. Compared to the original donkey engines, they were mechanical giants. Thick steel frames supported massive boilers that roared with constant fire. Heavy winch drums wrapped with hundreds of yards of steel cable sat at the rear of the machine. A tall smokestack rose above everything, pouring smoke into the forest sky. The skidder didn't travel often. Instead, it ruled its territory like a mechanical predator. Once positioned, workers anchored to ground with giant logs called dead men, buried deep into the soil. These anchors kept the machine from being dragged forward when it pulled massive loads. Then the cables were stretched outward through the forest, sometimes half a mile away. And once the cables were attached to felled trees, the machine began its work. Steam hissed. The operator opened the throttle. The winch drums began to turn. And slowly, impossibly, giant trees started sliding through the wilderness toward the roaring engine. To the logging companies, the steam skidder was nothing short of revolutionary. But to the men working beside it, the machine felt almost alive. It breathed smoke and steam. It growled and hammered with mechanical fury. Its cables moved like muscles stretching across the forest floor. And when it pulled at full power, the ground itself seemed to tremble. Some workers even swore the machine had moods. On good days, it ran smoothly, dragging logs like toys. On bad days, cables snapped, drums jammed, and the entire machine shook violently as if trying to tear itself apart. But regardless of its temperament, the steam skidder had arrived, and with it came a new era of industrial logging. The forests that once resisted human effort were about to face something far more relentless. Not animals, not manpower, but a roaring machine powered by fire and unstoppable steam. If you stood close to a working steam skidder in the early morning, you would feel it before you fully saw it. A deep vibration moving through the ground, a low metallic rhythm echoing through the trees, and then the sound of fire roaring inside iron. Because at the heart of the steam skidder was something surprisingly simple. Not electricity, not computers, just fire, water, and pressure. But together, those three elements created one of the most powerful machines the logging industry had ever seen. The workday usually began long before sunrise. While the forest was still dark and quiet, the skidder crew arrived at the machine. The boiler sat cold and silent from the night before, its thick steel shell covered with soot and ash. The firemen climbed onto the small platform beside the boiler and opened the furnace door. Inside was a firebox, the heart of the entire machine. He shoveled wood or coal into the chamber and lit the fire. Slowly at first, flames began licking around the iron walls. Then the heat grew stronger. Inside the boiler, thousands of gallons of water surrounded the furnace chamber. As the fire burned hotter, the water began to boil. Minute by minute, pressure started building. Steam gathered inside the sealed boiler like an invisible storm. The pressure gauge climbed steadily. 20 pounds, 50 pounds, 100 pounds of pressure pushing against the thick steel shell. Only when the pressure reached the right level did the operator step forward. He grabbed a heavy metal lever connected to the steam valves. This was the moment when the sleeping machine awakened. The operator slowly opened the valve. Instantly, high-pressure steam rushed through thick pipes toward the engine's pistons. Inside the cylinders, the steam expanded violently, pushing the pistons back and forth with explosive force. Those pistons were connected to long steel rods. The rods turned massive rotating shafts, and those shafts drove the winch drums, huge cylinders wrapped in layers of thick steel cable. Once the drums began turning, the rail work started. The cables stretched outward into the forest like long metallic arms. Sometimes they ran hundreds of yards through trees, rocks, and brush until they reached the chokermen working deep in the woods. Those men wrapped the cable around fallen logs using heavy metal hooks called chokers. Then they stepped back and gave the signal. Often it was a whistle, sometimes a shout, sometimes a tug on a smaller signal line connected to the machine. The operator heard the signal. He pulled the throttle. The drum spun faster, and suddenly, the steel cables tightened with enormous force. Somewhere in the forest, the logs began to move. At first, they shifted slightly, scraping against the dirt. Then the full strength of the machine took over. Massive trunks weighing several tons slid across the forest floor. Branches snapped. Rocks rolled away. Smaller trees bent or broke beneath the moving weight. Sometimes a single log was pulled. Other times, several logs were attached to the same cable, creating a moving wall of timber scraping its way toward the skidder. The noise was overwhelming. The steady pounding of pistons. The screech of steel cable dragging across bark and stone. The grinding rumble of logs tearing through brush. To workers nearby, the machine sounded less like equipment and more like a living creature fighting the forest. But controlling that power required skill. The operator had to watch everything carefully. Too much throttle could overload the cable. Too little power and the logs wouldn't move. Experienced operators developed a sense of timing. They listened to the machine. They watched the tension in the cables. They felt the vibration of the drums beneath their feet. Some could control the skidder with remarkable precision, pulling logs through tight spaces without smashing into surrounding trees. But even the best operators knew something important. The steam skidder was never completely predictable. Steel cables stretched under enormous pressure. Steam boilers operated at dangerous temperatures. One weak link in the system, one damaged cable, one overheated valve, and the machine's immense power could turn instantly from useful force into violent destruction, because the same pressure that moved mountains of timber could also tear steel apart. Before the steam skidder roared to life each morning, the logging camps were already awake. Long before sunrise, the men stirred inside rough wooden bunkhouses scattered deep in the wilderness. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp wool, sweat, and with smoke from the iron stove burning through the night. Outside, the forest was still dark. Cold air crept between the trees. And somewhere in the distance, the silent outline of the steam skidder waited like a sleeping giant. But the machine could not run itself. It needed men. And the men who worked around the skidder lived one of the hardest lives in the entire logging industry. The workday began early, very early, often around 4 or 5 in the morning. The cookhouse was usually the first building alive with activity. A large iron stove filled the room with heat, while cooks prepared enormous meals. Eggs, bacon, potatoes, thick bread, and strong black coffee. Logging crews ate quickly. They had to, because the forest waited. And once the whistle blew, the machines would start. After breakfast, the men stepped out into the cold morning air. Some walked toward the cutting areas where trees were being felled. But the skidder crew moved in a different direction, toward the machine. The steam skidder sat like a massive iron animal surrounded by cables that stretched into forest. Its boiler was already heating, smoke drifting from the tall stack as the firemen fed the furnace with fresh wood. This crew usually consisted of several key roles. First was the operator, the man responsible for controlling the entire machine. He stood on the narrow platform beside the roaring boiler, hands gripping heavy metal levers that controlled steam pressure and drum speed. The operator's job demanded experience. One mistake could snap a cable or send logs crashing unpredictably through the forest. Next came the fireman, whose job was brutally simple. Keep the fire alive. All day long, he shoveled fuel into the furnace, maintaining the intense heat required to keep the boiler producing steam. The work was exhausting. Flames blasted heat against his face even during the coldest winters. But the men farthest from the machine faced an even more dangerous role. They were called chokermen. Chokermen worked deep in the forest where the logs lay scattered across the ground. They carried heavy steel hooks and lengths of cable, moving carefully between fallen trees and tangled brush. Their job was to wrap the main cable around each log using the metal chokers. Then they stepped back and signaled the operator. Once the signal was given, the machine pulled, and the chokermen had to move fast. Because the moment those logs started sliding across the forest floor, they became unpredictable. Sometimes the logs moved smoothly. Other times they bounced, rolled, or spun suddenly as they encountered rocks and stumps. The chokermen had to stay alert every second. If they stumbled, if they hesitated, the moving timber could crush them instantly. Despite the danger, the men formed strong bonds in the camps. They worked together, ate together, and faced the same brutal conditions day after day. Logging camps were isolated places, often miles from the nearest town. Supplies arrived by wagon or rail, sometimes only once a week. Entertainment was limited. After long days in the forest, the men returned to camp covered in mud and sawdust. Some played cards under the dim glow of lanterns. Others simply collapsed into their bunks, too exhausted to talk. But among the workers, certain men gained reputations. Skidder operators especially. The best operators were respected throughout the camps. They understood the rhythm of the machine. They could listen to the pounding pistons and instantly know if something was wrong. They controlled enormous power with steady hands and calm judgment. Some even became minor legends in the logging world. Men who could pull massive timber through dense forests without destroying surrounding trees or injuring the crew. But even the most skilled workers knew something unsettling. No matter how careful they were, no matter how experienced the operator, the steam skidder was always dangerous, because the machine's power never truly rested. The cables remained under constant tension. The boiler burned with relentless heat. And somewhere deep in the forest, tons of timber waited to move. Every day, the workers stepped into a world where fire, steel, and gravity ruled the landscape. And every day, they trusted that the machine beside them would obey their commands. Most days it did, but not always. And when it didn't, the results could be devastating. In the logging camps, there was a phrase older workers often told the new men: respect the machine or the forest will bury you. It wasn't a warning meant to scare them. It was a fact. Because while the steam skidder transformed the logging industry, it also created one of the most dangerous work environments of the early industrial era. The machine's power was immense, but power without mercy can quickly turn deadly. And in the forests of the early 1900s, accidents were not rare stories whispered around campfires. They were part of daily life. The first danger came from something nearly invisible: tension. Steel cables stretched across the forest floor like giant metal snakes. Some of these cables extended hundreds of yards from the skidder to the chokermen, working deep among the fallen trees. When the machine pulled, those cables tightened with enormous force. Several tons of pressure surged through the steel lines. Under normal conditions, the cables held, but steel under tension behaves like a coiled spring. And when that spring breaks, the result is violent. Workers describe the sound as a sudden rifle crack echoing through the forest. A cable snapping under tension doesn't simply fall to the ground. It lashes through the air at terrifying speed. Sometimes a broken line whipped through the forest faster than a man could react. Trees were stripped of bark. Branches exploded into splinters. And if a worker stood in the wrong place at the wrong moment, the cable could slice through flesh and bone instantly. Even experienced loggers feared the cables. Many developed a habit of constantly watching them while they worked, instinctively judging the tension in the line by how tightly it vibrated. But cables were only one part of the danger. The steam skidder itself was another. At the heart of the machine, the boiler held thousands of pounds of pressurized steam. Inside that thick iron shell, water boiled continuously under intense heat from the furnace below. Pressure gauges climbed steadily as the fire roared. And if the pressure rose too high, the results could be catastrophic. Boiler explosions were among the most feared disasters in early logging camps. When a boiler ruptured, the release of pressure was explosive. The iron shell could tear apart with the force of a small bomb. Fragments of metal shot through the air like artillery shrapnel. Workers standing nearby had little chance to escape. Entire machines were sometimes destroyed in seconds. Even when the boiler held steady, the force itself remained dangerous. Logs dragged by the skidder rarely moved in straight lines. They scraped across rocks. They bounced over stumps. Sometimes they swung suddenly as the cable tightened. A chokerman attaching cables had only seconds to step away before the log started moving. If he slipped, if he tripped over brush or hidden roots, the sliding timber could crush him before anyone had time to react. And then there were the slopes. Much of the logging took place on steep hillsides where gravity worked alongside the machine. Once a heavy log began sliding downhill, it often gained momentum quickly, sometimes faster than the skidder operator expected. Logs rolled, spun, collided with other trees, and occasionally they broke free from the cable entirely, becoming runaway battering rams tearing through the forest. Winter added yet another layer of danger. Cold temperatures made steel cables brittle. Frozen ground turned trails into ice-covered slopes. Snow hid stumps and rocks beneath the surface, creating invisible hazards for workers trying to move quickly. Yet despite all these risks, the machines never stopped. Logging companies demanded production. Timber had to move. Railroads waited. Sawmills needed logs. So every morning the fires were lit again. Steam pressure climbed. The whistles blew, and the iron giants began pulling timber through the forest once more. Some workers survived years beside the machines. Others lasted only days. But every man who stepped into the skidder's reach understood something important. The steam skidder was not evil. It was simply powerful. And in the unforgiving wilderness of early industrial logging, power always carried a price. At first, the steam skidder looked like just another machine in the forest. A loud one, a dangerous one, but still just a machine. Yet within a few short decades, those roaring steam engines would quietly transform one of the largest industries in North America. Because the moment the steam skidder arrived in the forest, something remarkable began to happen. The scale of logging changed forever. Before steam power entered the woods, logging had been slow and limited. Crews could only harvest trees located close to rivers or simple skid roads. Horses and oxen could drag timber only short distances before exhaustion set in. Entire sections of forest remained untouched simply because the logs were too difficult to move. But the steam skidder erased that limitation. Suddenly, distance no longer mattered. A single machine could pull logs from hundreds of yards away, sometimes even half a mile. Forests that had once been considered unreachable were now within reach of steel cables and roaring pistons. Logging companies quickly realized what this meant. Where small crews once harvested timber in scattered patches, entire hillsides could now be cleared with astonishing speed. The skidder became the center of the operation. From its position deep in the forest, cables stretched outward in every direction like the spokes of a giant wheel. Each cable line reached a different cutting area. Chokermen attached logs. The operator pulled, and slowly the entire forest seemed to slide toward the machine. The efficiency was staggering. What once took weeks with horses could now be done in days. Railroad companies noticed the change immediately. Logging railroads began pushing deeper into the wilderness, laying temporary tracks behind the advancing operations. Steam locomotives waited at the edge of the forest to carry the timber to massive sawmills along the coast and in growing cities. Suddenly, the supply chain of the timber industry had become a coordinated industrial machine. Loggers in the forest, steam skidders dragging the timber, railroads hauling the loads, sawmills turning the logs into lumber, all moving together with unprecedented speed. Entire towns sprang up around the logging industry during this period. Remote regions of Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia filled with sawmills, company camps, rail yards, and supply depots. Communities that barely existed a decade earlier suddenly thrived because of the massive flow of timber coming out of forests. But the transformation didn't stop with production. The steam skidder also changed the way engineers thought about machines. The concept was revolutionary for its time. Instead of building machines that moved across terrain, engineers began designing machines that controlled terrain from a fixed position. The idea of powerful winches, cables, and anchored engines influenced many later technologies. Early mining equipment adopted similar systems. Construction cranes used related principles. Even modern logging machines, though far more advanced, still rely on the same basic concept first proven by the Steam Skidder, using mechanical power and cable systems to move massive loads across difficult landscapes. Over time, new machines began replacing the old steam engines. Gasoline and diesel engines gradually took over. Track tractors appeared in the forests, capable of driving directly across rough terrain. These machines were faster, more mobile, and easier to operate. Slowly, the great steam skidders disappeared from the logging camps. Their boilers went cold. Their smokestacks stopped pouring black clouds into the sky. But the legacy of those machines remained everywhere. The cities built with their lumber, the railroads supported by their timber, the industries powered by the forests they harvested. Without the steam skidder, much of the early expansion of the timber industry would have been impossible, because the machine did something no horse team could ever accomplish. It turned the wilderness into an industrial landscape, but the transformation came at a cost, because while the machines made the forest easier to harvest, they also accelerated something few people at the time fully understood: the rapid disappearance of those ancient forests. And the roaring steam engines that once dragged mountains of timber had quietly reshaped the land forever. Today, if you walk through a forest where the steam skidders once worked, you might not hear anything unusual. Just wind moving through the trees, birds calling in the distance, the quiet creaking of branches high above the forest floor. But 100 years ago, the same landscape sounded very different. It thundered. The ground trembled beneath iron machines. Steel cables screamed through the air. And somewhere deep in the trees, massive logs scraped across the earth as steam-powered engines pulled entire forests toward the waiting railroads. Those machines are gone now. The great boilers that once roared day and night have long since gone cold. Their iron frames have rusted away or sit quietly in museums, silent reminders of a brutal era of industrial expansion. Yet the story of the steam skidder is still written across the land. Look closely at the hillsides of the Pacific Northwest, and you can still see the scars, old skid trails carved to the forest floor, where heavy logs once dragged their way downhill. Some trails have been softened by decades of rain and moss. Others remain clearly visible, winding through the trees like faint memories of the machines that created them. But the skidder's legacy is not just carved into the earth. It is woven into the very structure of the modern world. The lumber pulled from those forests built railroads that crossed continents. It framed the homes of growing cities. It supported factories, bridges, warehouses, and ports. Entire industries rose on the strength of timber harvested by machines that worked far from civilization. The steam skidder was never elegant. It was loud, dirty, dangerous. But it represented something powerful about the time in which it existed. A moment in history when human determination met industrial invention, when engineers looked at the enormous challenge of the wilderness and decided to build machines strong enough to overcome it. For the workers in the logging camps, the skidder was both ally and threat. It fed their livelihoods. It built the towns they lived in. But it also reminded them daily of the brutal forces they worked beside. Fire inside iron boilers. Steel cables stretched under enormous pressure. Gravity pulling thousands of pounds of timber down steep mountainsides. Every man who stood near those machines understood the balance between control and chaos, because the steam skidder did not forgive mistakes. And yet, despite the danger, the men returned to machines every morning. They shoveled coal into the fireboxes. They tightened the cables. They listened for the whistle. Then they watched as the forest itself began to move. In many ways, the steam skidder represented the spirit of the early industrial age. Human beings pushing deeper into the wilderness, building machines capable of reshaping entire landscapes, harnessing fire, metal, and pressure to solve problems that once seemed impossible. But progress always leaves behind two kinds of marks. One is visible in the city's railroads and industries that grew from the timber pulled out of those forests. The other is quieter. It exists in the memories of the workers who risked their lives beside those machines. and in the forests themselves, which slowly grew back over the scars of industrial logging. Today, modern logging equipment is faster, safer, and far more efficient. Diesel engines have replaced steam. Hydraulic arms have replaced steel cables. Operators now sit inside enclosed cabs with computer controls. Yet the basic idea remains the same. A powerful machine, a difficult landscape, and the human determination to move something enormous through it. The steam skidder may no longer roar through the forests, but its story reminds us of something important. The modern world was not built quietly. It was built with fire and iron boilers, with steel cables cutting through the wilderness, and with machines powerful enough to drag mountains of timber across the earth. Machines that turned forests into industry and helped shape the world we live in today.